Have you ever had a reaction that felt kind of disproportionate to what actually happened? And you could feel that in real time? Not just after the fact, but while it was happening. Where part of you was thinking, this doesn't really match the situation, and yet the reaction kept building anyway. I'm Kristen, and I work with high achievers who are used to being the one people rely on. They're thoughtful, self-aware, and generally very good at navigating complex situations, which is exactly why this experience feels so unsettling for them. Because when their reactions don't line up with the moment, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels confusing in a way that's hard to explain. Most of the time, the situation itself isn't really that significant. It might be a delayed response from someone you respect, or maybe a short message that feels slightly off, or a piece of feedback that objectively is neutral or even helpful. But your reaction is not neutral. There's a shift internally that feels immediate and hard to ignore. You might notice yourself tightening, second guessing, shutting down, or trying to correct something that may not even be wrong. And what makes this more complex is that you're aware of it while it's happening. You can see that the intensity doesn't quite make sense, but that awareness doesn't seem to change the reaction. So now you're holding two experiences at once. You're reacting, and you're also analyzing the reaction as it unfolds, and usually feeling guilty about it. This is usually the point where the interpretation turns inward. Not in an obvious or dramatic way, but in a quieter, more subtle, automatic way. You start to question yourself. You might think, I'm being too sensitive, or I should be able to handle this better, or this shouldn't be affecting me like this. And underneath all of that is a subtle assumption that the reaction is saying something about you. Especially if you're someone who values being thoughtful and self-aware, there's an added layer of frustration because you expect yourself to be able to make sense of your own reactions. I worked with someone recently who described a situation that illustrates this really clearly. She received a short message from someone she respected professionally, and there was nothing explicitly negative in the message, but something about the tone felt slightly off to her. So within minutes, she noticed a wave of anxiety. Not overwhelming, but enough to shift her attention completely. So she started rereading the message, trying to figure out what she may have missed. Then came the urge to respond carefully, to explain herself, to make sure she hadn't done anything wrong. She rewrote her response multiple times, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because something in her felt like the stakes were higher than they actually were. When we slowed the situation down, what became more clear was that the reaction didn't match the moment, but it did match something else. And this is where the gap tends to show up. You're evaluating the situation based on what is happening right now, but your reaction is being shaped by patterns that were formed way earlier. And there's a difference between what's happening in front of you and what your system is interpreting that moment to mean. And that interpretation happens quickly. It's instantaneous, and it's not something you consciously decide. If you have had experiences where getting something wrong changed how you were treated, or where maybe being misunderstood had a consequence, or where your role was to anticipate and adjust to other people, then those patterns don't disappear just because you're now in a different environment. They continue to influence how you read situations, especially ones that feel even slightly similar. So when we look at reactions through this lens, they start to make more sense. On the surface, it looks like your reaction is about what just happened. But underneath that, there are layers that are influencing how that moment is being processed. So part of you is responding to the present situation, roughly 20% if we want to get more specific, but another part of you is responding to something that feels familiar, even if you can't immediately place it. And that's the 80% from the past. That's your subconscious operating system. It might be a sense that you need to get this right, or that you can't afford to be misunderstood, or that something about how you're being perceived could shift. These responses aren't random, they're patterned. They were shaped in environments where paying attention or adjusting or getting things just right had a level of importance that stayed with you. And this is why the intensity can feel really confusing, because you're trying to explain your reaction using only the present moment, when in reality the reaction is only partially about what just happened. A smaller portion is about the current situation, a much larger portion is about what that situation activated internally. So once you start looking at it in this way, the reaction stops feeling like an overreaction and starts to look more like a predictable response to something deeper. You might notice this in different areas of your life. For example, maybe you receive neutral feedback and find yourself becoming quiet or overly focused on what you might have done wrong. Not because the feedback was negative or harsh, but because part of you interprets it as a reflection of your worth. Or someone cancels plans and you feel a level of irritation or disappointment that seems stronger than the situation calls for, because part of you reads it as being deprioritized or disrespected. Or maybe you find yourself over-explaining in conversations, not because you're actually unclear, but because part of you is trying to prevent being misunderstood before it even happens. When you start to see these patterns, they begin to feel less random and more consistent. So instead of trying to control or minimize the reaction, it can be more useful to approach it with a different kind of curiosity. So first, you want to notice the split between the situation and the familiarity of the feeling. You might ask yourself, what part of this reaction is about what just happened, and what part of it feels familiar in a way that I've experienced before? You won't be able to explicitly tease these things apart, but you can start getting more curious about them. Second, you want to track the emotional pattern rather than focusing on the situation itself. So instead of asking why this is happening, you might ask, when else have I felt this exact emotional tone? Even if the circumstances were different, what part of me is reacting? And third is to put language to the different parts of your experience. So you might notice that there's a part of you that is interpreting the situation in a certain way, and another part of you that can see that the reaction is stronger than the moment might suggest. So you might have a defensive part, and then another part that judges that defensive part and wishes it wouldn't do that. Allowing both of those to exist without forcing a resolution can create a different kind of understanding. So a useful question to come back to is this: what did this moment mean to me beyond what actually happened? Not in a logical sense, but in a more immediate emotional way. That's often where the underlying pattern becomes more visible. Did it mean I'm not good enough? That I'm responsible for everything and everyone? That I'm powerless? Your action is not an identity label. It's useful information. It's pointing to something that has not been fully understood or updated yet. And when you start to approach it from that perspective, the question shifts. So instead of asking, what's wrong with me? You start asking, what is this showing me? And that shift alone tends to change how you relate to your reactions and over time, how you respond to them. So if this resonates, take a moment to think about a recent reaction that didn't quite match the situation. You can share it in the comments if you want to, or just write it down for yourself and come back to it with that question in mind. And if you want to explore this more deeply, I go further into these patterns in my book, Unpacked, where we start connecting these reactions to the patterns underneath them in a more structured way.